Hi, I'm Eve, and this is Colette. We met as part of us talking about climate and XR and thinking about being working class, and we've got into some quite interesting discussions about this. So I'm going to ask Colette a few questions. So Colette, do you identify as being working class yourself?
I tick the boxes of in terms of classic class indicators, if you like. So my dad was a tiler and he worked with his hands, and we lived in a council house on a council estate in Liverpool, and we were relatively poor. So I was born into a classification of working class and grew up in a working class community. But those socioeconomic indicators of class, what my dad did for a living, and the fact that we lived in a rented council house, which still mark our and classify our beginnings, if you like, I just feel have such an obliterating effect and erase the detail of working people's lives, really the strengths and gifts of the people who are poor, who work hard, and who probably suffer considerably. So I think while identities can be useful to rally around in that sense, they can also be identities that people try to get away from, or classifications like that. So I think what I want to say about those classifications of class is that in terms of my working class community, they say nothing about the resilience and integrity and creativity and ethics of the people that I grew up with. So, you know, I think we rarely hear about the qualities of working class people or working class communities. The fact that we have really informed and a valuable view from below, as it were, we're close to the bottom of the hierarchy in terms of power and wealth, but those conditions spawn really valuable perspectives and human qualities, like a clear seeing of how power is used and misused, and a political intelligence, and it, from my understanding, a kind of emotional intelligence based on generosity to others in the face of adversity and austerity. So I think those classifications, using those classifications, it's easy to kind of believe that there's nothing to be learned from poor working class communities or their way of doing things or organising, their way of resolving conflict. And yet these are the very people who've been surviving crisis conditions for decades and generations. So right now it feels to me that a lot of people are talking about how to survive hard times, but those people may not have actually had such hard times. So it feels like, you know, who gets to speak and who is heard is a power issue, and who would dream of going to the poor and working class communities, asking them for their survival wisdom. I suspect we're too busy telling them what we think they should be doing, and that's a power issue. And what it actually does is prevents cross-pollination of wisdom and experience. So yeah, I was born into that designation. I was classed without me consent in a way. But I want to say, yeah, that was the class that I was designated, but I want to talk about things beyond those social impositions. I want to talk about skills and gifts that are unheard, but that could really help us collectively right now.
Thank you. So what do you think, Colette? What do you think the link is between working class communities and the climate crisis? Do you think there's a link?
Yeah, I think there's a link between class designations and climate crisis. So for me, and obviously this is my take on things, climate crisis is a symptom. It's a symptom of the way that we've lived and a symptom of the way that we've used power and how we've misused each other. So climate crisis for me is like a physical expression of the culmination and inescapable result of institutionalized power misuse. So those things are inextricably linked for me. Class structures are a blatant, socially constructed device for separating people one from the other. Racism, sexism has the same effect. These socially sanctioned structures encourage us to believe that we're different, better, separate, or entitled to different or better treatment. So class structures, for example, enable people to have power over others, and that enables misuse of power. But it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop with us misusing different classifications of humans, as we might like to describe them. We have a power relationship with other beings, with animals, and then with the environment. So we just repeat the power over pattern until it's endangered our lives, really. And at under the root of power, it seems to me, is fear, human fear. I think it's a difficult and fearful thing to be alive. And the use of power feels like control, and it covers that that fear. So the way this is the way that I see it, that the divisions, class, race, have to be unravelled because they're destroying us. And to get to the root of that, it's like trying to find the place where the disease starts, really, and then grows into power over. So I look at power structures in society, and I see that the majority of power is held by white, privileged, middle and upper class, mostly men. So if I look across a range of organisations, that's the most frequent expression of power that I see. I suppose I just wanted to say that I think climate crisis, you know, we can protest against the symptoms, the end result of power misuse, or we can go to the root of that and look in our own lives where power misuse is happening in subtle or gross ways, and to ask ourselves personally, you know, about our position and our privilege and unconscious senses of entitlement that duplicate themselves. So I suppose what I'm saying is the analysis behind climate crisis has to go much deeper than I feel that we might want to go.
Yeah. So XR's been criticised for not having working class people, or many working class people in there. I wonder what you think about that, really.
Yeah, I've read the articles about XR being criticised in that way, and I think it's important that we don't just pick out one predominantly middle class dominated organisation, because that would be to miss the size of the problem here. My personal experience is that most organisations and movements are dominated by white, middle class, privileged, well educated folk. And my question is how could XR be any different? What would be the conditions there that would enable something different to happen? And that's an important question. It's it's not so much an accusation as a statement of fact that we have monocultures. Those with privilege tend to rise to the top and have organizational ability. But if you look at if you look at like XR or the mindfulness movement, or if it's predominantly white middle class, it's already failed in a sense, because it's a monoculture, and monocultures don't survive because they fail to appreciate or allow cross-fertilization of ideas or ways of being, and they don't recognize or encourage different ways of organizing. So the way I see it, monocultures are a vehicle that impose established orders, the same order that led to climate crisis in the first place. So I think, you know, you can see it as an accusation, or you can see it as a point where of exploration. If it's a monoculture, if you look at your organization and it's mostly white, middle to or upper class, then that's really good to see that, because it won't be representative of the population.
Yeah.
So I thought about Exxon and a lot, you know, of course, we need to act, we need to understand how we've got here, really. But I feel there needs to be a kind of shift in perspective, rather than going out to communities and say, you know, why are you absent from our organisations? It's kind of like asking the alienated to explain how that process has happened, and that's a tall order, you know what I mean? What I'd like to see is, if there's absence, start at home, ask these questions. You know, how is exclusion being maintained from the organisation? How have you got to have a monoculture? That hasn't happened by accident. It's happened drop by drop. So the questions for the organisation is, what are we doing that's creating a monoculture that's standing in the way of connection? So just to flip it around the other way, I don't want it. I have been the working class person in the middle class organisation. I have struggled to fit in with ways of doing things that are not natural to me. And I don't want to invite working class people into organisations that have not actively looked at their unconscious bias or how they maintain unequal power relations. So what I'd say is, if you want working class people to join your movement, don't ask them to come on board and work in middle class ways with a middle class agenda, which is undeclared because it's seen as naturalised or right and beyond the possibilities of even being questioned, because that just continues power imbalances. So I banged on a little bit about this, but how can we possibly change these deep-seated patterns without training? How could that happen? We need an ability to reflect on the organisations and structures that we've built and the personal patterns that we've built up towards power, towards possession, towards our position in society. And that requires an individual declaration of privilege. This is very personal work, and it has to be done because power sits within the threads of that social conditioning.
So we're kind of back to what you were saying before about climate crisis being the symptom. Yeah. And it feels like we have to go back, to step back and further back to see all the different threads that have gone into that result. So what do you think? I mean, obviously XR's there. It's a big organisation. It's probably the biggest organisation that there has been around climate. And we don't want it to be an organisation that's just white middle class people. We want it to include those people that include, like you say, working class people, people of different races, etc. What do you think might help then? Because we're not going to start all over again, are we, today? We've got this now, and the time is now for us to maybe be making some changes.
Yeah, I think we bungle forward, and perhaps we tend to be reactive as circumstances come. But I believe eventually we will have to do the work, each one of us and collectively, at looking at our social conditioning. And it's really tense because that takes time, and there's a really strong push to hurry up. But just in terms of, say, looking at a working class community, I look at my Irish Catholic immigrant background, and I see the climate crisis. It's written in the body of my sister, in the pollution from factories and the pollution from where she lived. So the threads of the climate crisis are written in her body, and in the poor education system that operated in places like Liverpool for many people for many years. So I see the actual physical suffering that predates climate crisis in a way. I see those people who have lived through that, and they've been managing crisis for a long time. And I see that they're suffering as a result of the misuse of resources and power, really. So I think one of the things is those communities have got a lot of wisdom. They have survived quite considerable odds. And I think the first thing is to really feel that the suffering, that the sense of abandonment, and to really feel that, because that leads to understanding, and that leads to connection, and to begin to understand psychologically why it is that we think that we can abandon parts of our communities and there not be any consequences. So some emotional work, I feel, has to happen. Rushing into working class communities, or people on white horses or banging drums, it feels opinionated and too hasty. It feels like there needs to be some reflection on what is your agenda. Are you pretending that there is no agenda? Have you examined your social conditioning? Who has the power to make agendas in your organisation? Because remember, this all comes back to power. It all comes back to who's got power, who's using it, and who's seen as not having it. So looking at how power is maintained in any organisation, it has to happen, because climate crisis is a result of not doing that work. And even if we're running out of time, we can't continue with power structures that will fail us in the long run. And there are really difficult questions to ask. I grew up in Liverpool in the late 70s and 80s, and I saw generations and generations of people who had nothing and no jobs, no chance of a job. Loads of my mates had to move away. They couldn't stay with their family and the community. And the psychological damage that does. And I didn't get the feeling, to be honest, as I watched the stockbrokers swigging champagne bottles from the back of gold-coloured convertibles, that they cared about what was happening to my community. And I have a suspicion it's like, well, why do you care about places like Liverpool and Croxteth and Kirkby and Oldham now? Is it because your own power misuse and patterning is beginning to affect you? It still doesn't feel like there's like you actually care about the communities that I came from. And the middle classes profited massively from neoliberalism, good jobs, buying houses, several houses, high standard of living.
Yeah.
That was running parallel to communities like Liverpool and places like Blackpool, just falling further and further and further into difficult conditions. And I think we need to acknowledge that. I think we need to say, yeah, that happened. And then we need to ask, how could I be part of a system that does that? So, and why do that? Well, this is just my humble opinion. The far right makes gains in really poor working class places because they offer an emotional hook. They offer a release for anger and despair. When people are left out of the circle of benefit, they will seek comfort elsewhere. And we all need to see the cost of damage, really, that's been accumulating for decades.
These ideas of us all being in the same boat. I mean, places that you've described and some of the mining communities, for example, particularly in the north of the country, they've all been through this before, haven't they? Many times.
Yeah.
And actually, if some of these industries, like oil producing industries, etc., they're going to be working class people working in those, probably petrified that if we make changes, what's going to happen to them all over again? Will it be just another repeat of what's happened in the past?
That's right, Eve. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. When we stop caring about any part of the whole, we are storing up trouble for all of us. It's like a long tail that comes back and lashes at us. And really, we need to start like a ethics of care. So, yeah. If we look at working class communities, that part of loving someone is to care and understand about their circumstances, but really critically to understand that when someone is abandoned, one of the casualties of abandonment is loss of communication. The bridges that we thought were there are not there. Why would they be there? Who's been walking across them, linking, affluence and poverty? Those bridges have been burned to a degree, and we need to psychologically put them back in place. And although climate crisis is the most pressing thing that we can deal with, it may not be where we need to start in terms of building bridges, but certainly I think some admittance that the neoliberal project has caused tremendous damage to some communities and alienated them. To acknowledge that, I think, would be wise. So as I'm thinking about it, and I'm just talking about my community, I was born in 1963. This is it's socially located in time, and things have moved on since then. But so I can only tell you from my perspective. I saw that working class communities were kind of abandoned in a sort of disabling pincer movement. And the first thing was crummy education, low standard of education led to an erosion of critical thinking, the ability to discern the truth from fiction. And what I see now is, I see like a psychological manipulation from the media and the spin doctors aiming at that very low level of ability of critical thinking, coming up with little mantras like, we'll get this done, or our response to COVID is a success. And those are like hooks promising ease and clarity and a brighter future, but obscuring what's actually happening. So for me, education, people's kitchen, conversation cafes, whatever format, is the inoculation against the disease of psychological manipulation. We've got working class people now voting against their own interests. That should alarm everybody, because what is actually going on there? So any approach that disempowers working class communities any further, I think, ought to be avoided. We need to empower all sections of the whole, really, but we need to find out how to do that and the best way to do that. So
there's something in there, isn't there, about actually having the opportunity for people to be able to talk from all those different groups, you know?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit reminiscent of the process that we went through. There was 4 working class people we'd never met before. We came together. It was a little bit chaotic at first, and then we shared our life experiences, and we had a laugh, and there was emotion, and there was sadness at the different ways that we'd suffered and the different ways other people had suffered, and it felt like we went on a bit of a journey together. But you know, we talked about our lives, and we heard our lives reflected back by other people, and maybe that built safety. Or in any case, we began to look more deeply, I thought, at what had happened and what could happen. So for me, often with middle class organisations, I'm just the person with the northern accent who's a little bit different, and I'm often referred to as a breath of fresh air, or some phrase that makes me out as different. But if you look at, for example, all the people who are talking about climate crisis, all the people who have got a lot of airspace, like George Monbiot and Charles Eisenstein, all hyper privileged white middle class guys. And it would be nice for those people with that much power and space to sometimes shut up and sit down and give someone else from a different background with a different life experience, who has no power and no access to networking, to give them a voice. Those sacrifices, I think, need to be made by powerful middle class people as well.
Thanks, Colette. Thank you for that.